Hello everyone, this is El Spectra. Welcome back to the Land of Empires. And after the maintenance yesterday, we discovered a major change that happened to the arena system in the Land of Empires. And this is quite impactful, I would say, and I want to dedicate this video, quite impromptu actually, to discussing this change. Now, as everyone know, in season 6 and 7, the defensive side has a major advantage where if you win the defense, what happens is that your enemy your enemy's team, even though they may have troops left over, they just lose and their troops get discarded while your team gets to fight their next team. And this has kind of been an issue because, especially in season 6, you can have very powerful defensive setup with the season 6 infantry hero because they are just super tanky. And in season 7, this is also a kind of an issue, although it can be to some degree mitigated by having kind of a more dummy setup to sacrifice themselves into the strong team of the enemy, which is either 776 or 676. And I use these numbers to represent the respective seasons. So, for example, 776 can be a variation. I could probably show it somewhere here. Uh, so so here you can see Raikkonen is running a 776 representing his team 2. And 676 is also fairly popular. You can see JFK's team 2 is 676. So the logic here is to have the cavalry hero confer almost like an invincibility power boost to the infantry. And the invincibility power boost basically means that your team will get a guaranteed win when you are on the defensive side. However, when you're on the attacking side, using these teams against an equivalent enemy team, so whether that's a mirror or a 676 versus 6776 or vice versa, you will be guaranteed to lose simply due to how invincible the infantry hero becomes. And now I think it is the time to mention what was changed. And this is, I think, a really big deal to the arenas moving forward. And this change is that instead of the defensive team winning when they have troops left over, it is now based on the ratio of remaining troops between the attacking side and the defending side. And I say ratio because take a look at this. I am attacking Greyhound, which is significantly weaker than I am. And this is just a kind of a test setup. You can see my stats are significantly higher than Greyhound, and I'm winning purely in essence of having less of a ratio of troops lost compared to Greyhound. We can see that Greyhound lost about 30% of their forces, while I lost about 20%. And this resulted in my win over Greyhound. And that is a big deal compared to what we had before, where the defenders were basically guaranteed the win if they could defend. I mean, if they had even one troop remaining against the attacker, remaining against the attacking side, I mean. And this led to some quite interesting scenarios where the defending side in Apex Arena only had just 2 or 3 troops left. It actually happened to me as well at one point. And the attacking side just completely lose, even though they only lost maybe 20% of their forces, simply because I was able to defend. But we can see that this is no longer the case. And now, kind of the question is, how does this change the meta? And the answer is, I don't know yet. Um, I think one of the big elements in season 7 is how important the cavalry hero is. So if you are winning, so if you are using too many cavalry hero because you don't want your cavalry hero to die before they use their ultimate, then then you then you will most likely lose to your opponent if your opponent is running a more conservative, I mean, a more ambitious setup with fewer cavalry. So, for example, if you're in a mirror setup and you run 676 versus 676, and your opponent is using fewer cavalries than you, and they have the same effect of the cavalry, making your infantry invincible. So you will end up losing a higher ratio of troops compared to your opponent simply because you used more cavalry. And I think this will make fights moving forward very, very, very interesting. And I say that because you cannot simply run fewer cavalries. Because if you run fewer cavalries, then I can still use a dummy team to kill off all your cavalries. Because the cavalry and archer, nothing has really changed about how combat works. They are still very, very vulnerable versus the majority of setups. So one of the strongest setups right now, and actually how I ended up losing in Apex Arena versus JFK at the end, I probably can't check it here anymore, but basically what happened was that JFK ran a primarily cavalry heavy 776 setup. And that 776 setup is actually very effective at dealing against any setup that isn't 776 or 676. In other words, any setup that does not use the Season 7 cavalry. However, under this new system, I can counter his cavalry heavy 776 setup with a minimal cavalry 776 setup or a 676 setup. And that would mean that his cavalry heavy setup will be guaranteed to lose against my setup, even under circumstances where he is stronger, simply because he will be left with a lower troop ratio at the end compared to me. So I just kind of want to showcase some of these fights, I guess. And really, what is different from Season 7 compared to Season 6 or other seasons is that the Season 7 cavalry just makes the infantry so tanky that it is kind of a balance in terms of how many cavalry you want to use, because you do not want to use so few cavalry and archers, mind you, that your enemy can just throw a dummy team to completely cripple your team against the following team that you're going to fight. However, at the same time, you do not want to use too few cavalry so that your cavalry will just get one shot. I mean, you don't want to use too many cavalry so that the opponent can use a similar mirror team or a 776 setup to win against you purely on the basis of unit ratio lost. So I think moving forward, it will be very interesting to see how people kind of play out in terms of how they balance the troop defense. I think now with this additional arena change, which I'm not actually quite sure whether it's good or not yet, it's definitely not a bad change, I would say, compared to what we had before. I think it would certainly shake things up a bit. It will make arena a bit more interesting than just simply timing your opponent out and winning on the basis of having more than one defense troops remaining. And one thing that I also want to emphasize before I close this out is that we also tested combat in flags and towers. So some of you may question, say, if a defense that is situated within a tower, so if a garrison loses a higher troop ratio from an attacker, would the attacker suddenly be able to control the tower despite the garrison not like completely losing their troops? And the answer to that, at least for now, is no. So the defending side will still remain in control of the tower, and it appears that the new changes only apply to the arenas. It certainly applies to the Arena of Honor, and we will see in a few days whether it applies to the Arena of Legends and the Apex Arena. And I think the most likely scenario is that it will. And it will definitely make the Arena of Legends and the Apex Arena much more interesting than it is right now. In terms of how difficult it will be to beat opponents within the Arena of Legends, at least just looking at the setups that people are running and potential counters to what people are running, I think it will not really have too much impact in the Arena of Legends, because there are still counters to everything. If someone runs 676, then before this update, they have, for example, the option to run a high quantity of cavalry. So if they run a lot of cavalry, it means that you cannot simply kill this 676 setup with, for example, this team 1, which is 663. 663 is very effective at dealing with 676 when the cavalry count is low. The theory is basically the infantry survives long enough to kill the cavalry. Well, the infantry will kill the archer first, and then the infantry will kill the cavalry. And then Kellerman is basically left alone without the cavalry buff against the opponent's next team, and that makes this team very easy to beat with the following team without incurring too much losses. Now, if they run high cavalry, for example, if they run 70,000, let's see how many he ran here, very low. I think this is a better example. So I ran 10,000 cavalry here. 100,000 cavalry, and I was able to, I guess, catch young OG here by surprise on the last day, because he might have been running a composition that simply killed off my cavalry and then killed off my solo Kellerman with his next composition. However, when I ran a high quantity of cavalry, he was not able to kill the cavalry. And when you're not able to do that, then the cavalry can once again confer the quote-unquote invincibility buff, which is kind of just like, it lets the Kellerman takes like 10 times less damage, more than 10 times less damage than he usually does. So basically my cavalry survived, and it was able to give Kellerman said buff in the next fight. And that's what made Young OG lose. But under this new setup, Young OG can basically run a mirror team, or you run 776 against this team. And he'll be able to crush this team despite me having survivors left, simply because he can run fewer cavalry than I am, so that at the end of the day, maybe I would lose 40% and he would lose only 20%. So I think Arena of Legends, there might be some minor changes, but I think a lot of compositions can still be countered as long as your overall power is within the realm of your opponent. So within like you don't want to be too weak. So if you're Glorious 10, for example, I think you stand a good chance versus someone with maybe 30 million higher Lord power than you, or even 50 million Lord power higher than you. But if the enemies say Glorious 10, T12, and you're Glorious 6, then you just simply have no chance. In the Apex arena, I think this is where things will really spice up with this change. And that is because typically in the Apex arena, what people tend to do is they kind of bring a fairly weak defense and play that risky card during the matchmaking process, where the top 32 players get to move on to the next round. What people would do is they run a weak setup and they do not end up in the top 4. So when they're not in the top 4, then they have a good chance of being the defender instead of the attacker, who is on the top left side. So the defenders are on the bottom right side and the attackers on the top left side. But with this new change, I think one of the biggest fixes is that there's no longer any distinction between the attacker and the defender. As long as you are able to maintain a higher ratio of troops at the end, then you will be victorious. So I think carrying through with what I just talked about in terms of the combat dynamics and how different compositions can still be countered, at least within the context of Season 7, I think that will make the Apex arena very interesting moving forward. And I do look forward to changes in how people design their setups in the upcoming days, in the upcoming rounds of the Apex arena. Now, what this change will not really affect are seasons below season 6. So season 5, we don't really run into the issue of counters. So I mean we don't really run into the issues of stalling. So the stalling issue it does not really present itself until season 6. So anyways, I hope this video, which I wasn't expecting to make because this was not in the patch notes, we just discovered this and tested it today. I hope everyone enjoyed this information. Please look forward to my next video, which will probably be either a commentary on server 10 versus server 22, or a review of the new Titanos. So in my review, I will review every single Titanos from season 1. And I think that will make for a very interesting and very informative video, because I think these Titanos, they all have their own strengths to some degree, except for Chaos. I think Chaos is just absolute garbage besides its stats. But I'll talk about that more in depth in that video. So hope everyone enjoyed. I'll see everyone in the next video. Take care.